There's a moment when someone expects you to speak, to defend yourself, to fill the uncomfortable void they've created with your voice. And in that moment, most people crack. They explain, they justify, they scramble to make the other person comfortable. But what if I told you that silence, when wielded correctly, isn't just the absence of words? It's a weapon that can command respect, create fear, and bend entire rooms to your will without uttering a single syllable. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. While others were shouting their way to temporary victories, he was studying the devastating power of strategic silence. Not the silence of the weak, not the silence of those who have nothing to say, but the calculated, deliberate silence of those who choose when their words deserve to exist in the world. Today, we live in the loudest era in human history. Everyone's talking, posting, commenting, reacting to everything. The noise is deafening. And in this chaos of constant chatter, the person who masters silence doesn't just stand out. They dominate. Because while everyone else is giving away their power through words, you're accumulating it through restraint. But here's what most people don't understand about weaponizing silence. It's not about being quiet. It's about making your quiet feel dangerous. There's a difference between someone who doesn't speak because they're shy and someone who doesn't speak because they're calculating their next move. One makes you forget they exist. The other makes you wonder what they're planning. The average person uses silence as a default, something that happens when they don't know what to say. But Machiavelli would tell you that's amateur thinking. Strategic silence is active, not passive. It's a choice, not an accident. And when you learn to deploy it with precision, you stop being someone who reacts to the world and become someone the world reacts to. Let me show you exactly how this works. Picture this scenario. You walk into a room where someone's been talking about you behind your back. Everyone knows it. The tension is thick. The person who was gossiping expects you to confront them, to demand an explanation, to create drama. What do most people do? They take the bait. They give that person exactly what they want, a reaction, validation that their words had power over you. But what happens when you say nothing? When you simply acknowledge their presence with a brief nod and move on with your conversation as if nothing happened? Suddenly, they're the one feeling uncomfortable. They're the one wondering if you heard, if you care, if you're planning something. Your silence becomes their obsession. They start overanalyzing every glance, every pause, every moment you choose not to engage. You've flipped the power dynamic without saying a word. This is the first law of weaponized silence. Never give them the reaction they're fishing for. Because the moment you do, you've confirmed that their words have power over your emotions. But when you withhold that reaction, when you let their provocation hang in the air unanswered, you make them question their own impact. And doubt is the beginning of their downfall. Most people think power comes from having the last word. Machiavelli knew better. Power comes from making others desperate to know what your last word might be. When you speak constantly, you become predictable. People learn your patterns, your triggers, your responses. They start managing you before you even realize you're being managed. But when your words are rare, when they come with weight and precision, every syllable carries the force of intention. Think about the most powerful people you've encountered in your life. Not the loudest ones, not the ones who dominated every conversation. The ones who made you lean in when they chose to speak. The ones whose silence felt heavier than most people's speeches. They understood something fundamental about human psychology. We fear what we cannot predict, and we respect what we cannot easily access. Here's where it gets psychological. When you withhold your immediate reaction, you force others to fill the void with their own assumptions. And here's the fascinating part. Those assumptions are almost always more generous to you than the reality would have been. They assume you're above the petty drama. They assume you're too busy with important matters to engage. They assume you know something they don't. Your silence becomes a blank canvas onto which they project their own insecurities and fears. But there's a specific technique Machiavelli would use that goes beyond simple silence. He would create what I call the weighted pause. This isn't just not speaking. This is the deliberate use of silence as punctuation in your interactions. When someone asks you a question, you don't rush to answer. You let the question settle. You hold their gaze. You let them feel the full weight of having asked for your attention. Then, when you do respond, your words land with the force of consideration behind them. This technique works because it communicates something profound about your relationship with time and attention. It says your thoughts aren't reflexive reactions, but deliberate choices. It positions you as someone whose mental energy is valuable, not freely given to anyone who demands it. People start to understand that access to your thoughts is a privilege, not a right. The second law of weaponized silence is timing. Knowing when not to speak is more valuable than knowing what to say. Most people fill every gap in conversation because they're uncomfortable with tension. They see silence as something to be fixed rather than something to be leveraged. But tension is your ally. When you let uncomfortable silence exist, you make others rush to resolve it. And in that rush, they reveal more than they intended. Watch what happens in your next negotiation, your next difficult conversation, your next moment of conflict. After you make your point, say nothing. Don't elaborate. Don't soften the blow. Don't fill the space with qualifiers. Let your statement exist in the silence. Feel how the other person squirms. Watch how they start talking themselves into your position, or revealing their true concerns, or showing you exactly how much power your words actually carry. This is where most people fail. They make a strong point and then immediately weaken it by explaining it to death. They think more words equal more persuasion. But Machiavelli understood that the most persuasive argument is the one that lets the listener convince themselves. Your silence gives them space to do exactly that. But here's the advanced technique that separates amateurs from masters. You don't just use silence defensively. You use it offensively. You create strategic voids in conversations that force others to reveal information they weren't planning to share. You ask a pointed question and then become completely still. Not hostile, not impatient, just present and waiting. The pressure builds. They start talking to fill the void, and in that filling, they give you intelligence you never could have extracted through interrogation. The third law is consistency. Your silence must feel intentional, not accidental. There's a difference between someone who's quiet because they're unsure of themselves and someone who's quiet because they're sure of their position. Confidence changes everything about how your silence is perceived. When you're uncertain, silence feels like weakness. When you're certain, silence feels like strength. This means your posture matters. Your eye contact matters. Your energy matters. You're not hiding in silence. You're commanding from it. Your body language should communicate that you're not speaking because you've chosen not to speak, not because you don't know what to say. This is the difference between strategic silence and social anxiety. People can sense the difference immediately. Anxious silence makes others comfortable because they feel superior. Strategic silence makes others uncomfortable because they feel evaluated. And when people feel like they're being evaluated by someone who isn't revealing their assessment, they start performing for your approval. They start competing for your attention. They start wondering what they need to do to earn your words. This is how you begin to understand that silence isn't the absence of power. When wielded correctly, it's the concentration of power. Every word you don't say adds weight to the words you eventually choose to share. Every reaction you don't give makes your eventual reactions more significant. Every time you refuse to fill the void, you train others to value the moments when you decide that void deserves to be filled. But there's a darker level to this technique that most people never discover. Machiavelli didn't just use silence to avoid conflict. He used it to create psychological dependency. When you become the person whose words carry weight, whose attention feels valuable, whose approval seems worth earning, you've crossed into territory that goes beyond simple communication tactics. You've begun to architect how others relate to your very presence. This is what I call manufactured scarcity of validation. Most people give their opinions freely, their praise constantly, their emotional reactions immediately. They're emotionally generous, thinking this builds connection. But what it actually builds is emotional inflation. When your words are everywhere, they're worth nothing. When your approval is automatic, it becomes meaningless. But when both are rare, they become currency. Watch how this plays out in practice. Someone shares news with you, expecting immediate excitement or sympathy. Instead of rushing to match their energy, you pause, you consider, you let them feel the weight of having asked for your emotional investment. When you do respond, it's measured, thoughtful, deliberate. Suddenly, your response means something. They remember it. They value it. They start seeking it. This isn't cruelty. This is calibration. You're training people to understand that your emotional energy isn't free, that your attention has value, that your words, when they come, deserve to be heard. And here's what happens next. They start adjusting their behavior to earn these things from you. They speak more carefully around you. They consider their requests before making them. They stop taking your presence for granted. The fourth law of weaponized silence is selective deployment. You don't become a monk. You become someone whose speech feels intentional. This means knowing exactly when to break your silence for maximum impact. The goal isn't to never speak. The goal is to make every word count, to make every moment you choose to engage feel significant. There are specific moments when breaking strategic silence creates maximum psychological impact. When everyone expects you to remain quiet and you choose to speak, your words land with devastating force. When a room is filled with noise and chaos, and you cut through it with a single clear statement, you command immediate attention. When someone has been trying to provoke you for weeks, and you finally choose to respond, that response echoes. But here's the key insight that separates the powerful from the pretenders. Your silence must serve a purpose beyond just appearing mysterious. Every moment you choose not to speak should be gathering intelligence, building leverage, or positioning you for a more advantageous moment to engage. You're not quiet because you have nothing to say. You're quiet because you're deciding when what you have to say will have maximum effect. This requires a fundamental shift in how you view conversations. Most people see them as exchanges of information or opportunities for connection. But when you understand the deeper mechanics, you realize every conversation is a negotiation of status, a dance of power dynamics, a game where the rules are unspoken, but the outcomes are very real. In this game, the person who controls the tempo controls the outcome, and nothing controls tempo like strategic silence. When you refuse to be pulled into reactive conversations, when you won't be baited into defending positions you never took, when you let others exhaust themselves against your stillness, you're not just winning arguments. You're winning something far more valuable: psychological positioning. The fifth law is emotional neutrality under pressure. This is where most people's attempts at strategic silence collapse. They can be quiet when things are calm, but the moment someone pushes their buttons, they explode into explanation or defensiveness. But the moments when you're most tempted to speak are often the moments when silence serves you best. When someone insults you and you say nothing, you make them carry the full weight of their words without the relief of your reaction. When someone tries to guilt you into responding and you remain unmoved, you force them to confront their own manipulation. When someone demands an explanation and you offer none, you communicate something more powerful than any justification could: that you don't owe them access to your thoughts. This level of emotional control creates a psychological phenomenon that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. People begin to see you as someone who operates by different rules, someone who isn't governed by the same emotional reflexes that control others, someone who might be calculating things they can't see, planning moves they can't predict, holding cards they don't even know are in the deck. But here's where it gets truly sophisticated. You begin to use other people's need to fill silence as a source of information. You ask a simple question and then become completely still. Not hostile, not impatient, just present and waiting. The discomfort builds. They start talking to resolve the tension. And in that talking, they reveal far more than they intended. They tell you about their insecurities, their real motivations, their hidden agendas, their actual concerns. Information they never would have shared if you'd been filling the space with your own words, your own assumptions, your own need to keep the conversation moving. Your silence becomes a vacuum that pulls truth out of people who thought they were just making small talk. This is intelligence gathering disguised as social interaction. You're not interrogating them. You're simply creating space for them to interrogate themselves. And most people, when faced with sustained, comfortable silence from someone who seems perfectly at ease with it, will rush to fill that space with increasingly personal revelations. The sixth law is that your silence must feel like choice, not limitation. There's a world of difference between someone who doesn't speak because they can't, and someone who doesn't speak because they won't. The first inspires pity or dismissal. The second inspires caution and respect. Your energy, your posture, your presence must communicate that you have plenty to say but are choosing to hold it back. This means your silence can never feel like withdrawal or defeat. It must feel like power in reserve, like ammunition being saved for the right target, like a blade being kept sharp for the moment it's truly needed. People must sense that when you do choose to speak, it will be worth hearing. That when you do decide to engage, it will shift the entire dynamic of the situation. And here's the psychological masterpiece that Machiavelli would appreciate most. Once you establish this pattern, once people learn that your words come with weight and your attention has value, they begin to compete for both. They start performing for your approval. They begin second-guessing their own positions when you don't immediately validate them. They find themselves adjusting their behavior based on subtle cues from someone who barely speaks. You've reversed the normal flow of social energy. Instead of you working to fit into their world, they're working to understand yours. Instead of you explaining yourself to them, they're explaining themselves to you. Instead of you seeking their approval, they're seeking yours. And you've accomplished all of this not by speaking more persuasively, but by speaking less frequently. This is the ultimate expression of Machiavellian power. Not the loud dominance that announces itself, but the quiet authority that makes others announce themselves to it. Not the force that breaks things, but the gravity that makes things orbit around it. Not the voice that shouts over the crowd, but the silence that makes the crowd lower its voice. The final transformation happens when you realize that silence isn't just about withholding words. It's about becoming someone whose very presence changes the atmosphere of a room. When you master this technique, you don't just command respect through what you don't say. You command it through what people assume you could say, but choose not to. This is where most people misunderstand the endgame. They think the goal is to be mysterious for mystery's sake, to be quiet for attention. But Machiavelli's vision was far more sophisticated. The goal is to become someone whose silence carries more weight than most people's speeches. Someone whose withheld opinion becomes more valuable than freely given advice. Someone whose eventual words, when they come, reshape entire conversations. Here's what happens when you fully embody this principle. People start interpreting your silence as judgment. They begin assuming your quiet observation is evaluation. They project wisdom onto your restraint and depth onto your brevity. Your reputation begins to precede you into rooms before you even arrive. Others start saying things like, "Be careful what you say around them. They notice everything." Or, "When they finally speak, you better listen." But there's one final level that separates the truly powerful from those merely practicing techniques. You must learn to break your silence with such precision that every word becomes an event. When you've trained people to value your verbal contributions, when you've made your thoughts feel scarce and therefore precious, your eventual decision to speak must justify all that anticipation. This means your words, when they come, must cut deeper, land harder, and linger longer than anyone else's. Not because you're being dramatic, but because you've made every syllable count. You've removed all the filler, all the uncertainty, all the need to soften or qualify. What remains is pure intention delivered with the confidence of someone who speaks only when they have something worth saying. And here's the beautiful irony that Machiavelli would have smiled at. In a world where everyone is fighting to be heard, the person who speaks least often gets listened to most carefully. In an age of constant noise, silence becomes the rarest and most powerful sound. The one who masters this art doesn't just gain influence, they become influence itself, walking into rooms and changing them simply by choosing when to fill them with their voice and when to let others fill the void with their own desperate attempts to earn what can never be demanded. Respect that comes not from what you say, but from the weight others give to your choice of when to say it. Your silence, when wielded with this level of precision, becomes more than a communication strategy. It becomes a form of leadership that requires no title, a kind of authority that needs no announcement, and a type of power that grows stronger the less it has to prove itself. This is how you transform from someone who reacts to the world into someone the world reacts to, one carefully chosen word at a time.